Welcome to the lecture video for Chapter 18, the last one for Exam 3. We did it. I did it. You're gonna do it. And I believe in you. So with this lecture, we're going to talk about how communities age through time and how they change through time. Here's a picture of my friends, Oscar and Remy. They're my friends and collaborators at Ecosur in Chiapas in Mexico. Oscar's my best bumblebee friend forever. He also works on bumblebees. And this is a picture I took of them when I went to visit them, and the last time I visited them in 2018. This is a meadow that grows on in Remy's backyard. And it's a community. Look at all that diversity. There's trees, there's a meadow, there's thistle, there's everything. So, what we're primarily going to talk about with this lecture is succession. So if you're in the Monday section, you heard me talk about this. Succession is just temporal change in a community, and it's generally common to all environments. We're going to talk about aquatic succession and terrestrial succession today in different environments. A seer is a sequence of communities. So this is a seer looking at succession in a terrestrial woodland community. And then a seral stage is each of the changes in a seer. So this would be like each of these little blocks would be a seral stage here, where you see a change in the community. And seral stages are points on a continuum of vegetation through time. And seral stages are often recognizable as distinct communities. This is a very general map of how succession occurs in terrestrial temperate areas. So like we talked about, like I talked about with the Monday group, in an area that has not been colonized, typically the first terrestrial colonizers are lichens. Lichens are symbiotic relationships between fungi and either algae or cyanobacteria. They're autotrophs, and so they don't really need anything from the physical environment besides sunlight to grow. And so that's why you see lichens growing on rocks and other exposed surfaces, because they don't need anything. As those lichens grow in population and then they decay, their decay adds nutrients to the environment that can then be taken advantage of by things like mosses. As those mosses grow in population and then decay, they start to create soil layers which grasses and weeds can grow in. And then as that decaying and nutrient cycling happens again, then you get a thicker soil layer that allows for mixed herbaceous plants to grow, and the process continues over and over until eventually you have what's called a climax community, which is a forest. So what I talked about with the Monday group is that Winnie Palmer Nature Reserve is a prairie right now, but over the next 100, 200 years, if that prairie goes undisturbed and is maintained, it might eventually become a forest. So let's talk about some of the species that are early colonizers and late colonizers of terrestrial environments. Early successional species or pioneer species, so these are things like lichens, moss, and then grasses and wildflowers. Those are like in the earlier part of succession in a terrestrial community. Early successional species tend to have high growth rates, smaller size, high degree of dispersal, and high rates per capita growth. So they can colonize new areas very quickly, which is why they are early successional species. Late successional species, on the other hand, have low rates of dispersal and colonization. They have slower per capita growth rate. They're larger and long-lived. So these include things like woody trees. Trees tend to be late successional species because they have slower growth rates. This is a really great table for looking at the differences between the physiological characteristics of early versus late successional species. And what you see here is that early successionals tend to be things that can end up in an environment very quickly and then can grow very quickly when they arrive in that environment. This is a picture of Phillips track at University of Illinois. This is a picture I took when I was the teaching assistant for the ecology and evolution class there. And Phillips track has been a long-term study of succession going on at the University of Illinois. What you see here, and which I talked about with the Monday group, is that these strips that you see here, these are rows that are plowed every, now I'm going to get the years wrong, every, I think it's 1, 3, 5, and 7 years. And what you can see is that you see different strips of plant communities growing in each of them because they're at different successional stages. Now this tree line that you see at the back and that you'll also see here, this is another picture of Phillips track that was taken this year, obviously, because that professor is wearing a face mask. This tree line that's back here and back here, this is the longest running part of the experiment. This is the oldest part of the successional experiment. I think it's been maintained and undisturbed for like almost not a century. Maybe a century. I can't remember, but this is like the oldest species, and you can see all the herbaceous species, the woody trees back here, the late successional species, and then all of these that are cleared every few years, you can see the earlier pioneer species. This is a picture of Dr. Alex Harmon Threet. She is a professor at the University of Illinois who also works on bees. I was her teaching assistant for conservation biology, and she is now using Phillips track to study ground nesting bees. So they cleared out this area, put in native prairie, and then looked at ground nesting bee habitat in this prairie community. That's what this is a picture of. And I included a link to an article about this study that she's doing with her lab. She's really cool. We should have her give a guest talk sometime. Anyway. Aquatic environments can also change through time. So, as we talk about aquatic environments, let's make a distinction between primary succession and secondary succession. Primary succession occurs on a site that's previously unoccupied by a community. So this is a newly exposed surface that nothing has ever lived on before. What I talked about with the Monday group yesterday was that lava flows are great examples of primary succession because it's land that's never existed before. Sometimes when waters recede and water levels go down that have never gone down before, they can expose new surfaces that have never been colonized by terrestrial environments. You can also get primary succession in the ocean through the dying of coral reefs. So if a coral is built, so coral reefs are dead coral that then other things colonize. So if the coral grows anew, that becomes a new area that can be colonized. Secondary succession, on the other hand, occurs on sites that were previously occupied after a disturbance. So Phillips tract is an example of a study of secondary succession because that's not brand new land that's never been exposed. And what I mean by disturbance is any process that results in the removal, either partial or complete, of the existing community. So what they do at Phillips tract is they till it every few years to make that disturbance. This is a graph looking at rocky seashore succession, and this would be probably secondary succession because I'm guessing these rocks have been exposed before. So this is just a pattern of different species of algae that are then colonizing. So early succession, you get this ulva species here, and then you get a decline there, and then you see some of these Gigartina species. These are some of the pictures of the algae that we're talking about here. Oh, I have that one growing in my fish tank. Huh. Anyway, and then, oh yeah, it's like my fish tank is like a successional study. I guess it would be primary succession because it tank was empty beforehand. Anyway, and then you see like a real big peak in Gigartina, and then you see another peak, and then you see some other peaks here. And so this is just showing like the succession of algal species in rocky seashore succession. So typically in like intertidal ocean succession, the early colonizers are going to be algae because they're the main autotrophic photosynthetic organisms that are in the ocean, those in cyanobacteria. Let's talk a little bit about primary succession and how that occurs. So, like I said, it occurs on newly exposed substrates. This is a study of primary succession in sand dunes off of Lake Michigan. So, the sand was not there before. Then the sand was exposed. And because they know the dates of these sand dunes really well, and how they studied succession on these sand dunes is by constructing a chronosequence. Now, a chronosequence is a series of sites within an area that are at different stages of succession. But you know how old those sites are, so you can work backwards in time. So you can see dune age here. These are the points. So they know that some of these dunes are like 450 years old, some of them are 400, and so they compare the 500 to the 1 year, and they construct like a history of the plants that have colonized it based on age. That's a chronosequence. So this is not when you expose a new substrate and watch what comes. This is when you use sites you already know how old they are and how long they've been disturbed, and then you construct backwards from there. So we can look at this. We can try to construct a seer from this chronosequence data. So what you have here is 4 different types of plants that they've measured across each of these different dunes of different ages. So you've got dune age here. This is the oldest one. These are the youngest ones. So if we were going to make a hypothesis of what succession looks like in sandy areas off the coast of Lake Michigan, we would probably say that the earliest colonizers in a newly exposed or newly disturbed area would be beachgrass, because you see those in the youngest ones. And then we'd probably say that the next successional species would be shrub or bunchgrass, because you see a huge peak here. Now you do see a little bit of a peak in conifers, but you don't see them really taking over until the plot's about 400, 500 years old. And same with hardwoods. So this plays out exactly like we would thought. You see conifers and hardwoods dominating in the oldest plots because they're at their like climax stage of succession, and then you see shrub and bunchgrass. So our seer that we would have here would be beachgrass is the first seer, shrub bunchgrass is the second, and then probably conifers as the third, and hardwoods as the fourth. So make sure you can look at a graph like this on the exam and be able to construct a seer from the data presented from a chronosequence. And then also make sure that you understand what a chronosequence study is and be able to design an experiment using a chronosequence. And I have practice example questions of how to do that online. I am happy to check your answers for the practice examples to make sure that you understand what's going on. Okay, so that's primary succession. Let's talk about secondary succession. We have a really cool example of secondary succession really close by, and we would have gone there for a field trip if this wasn't a global pandemic, and I could have taken you in cars. If you haven't been, I highly encourage you to go. Spruce Flats Bog is about a 30-minute drive from campus, and it is an area that had previously been logged. So there was this conifer forest there. It was logged, and then because of the topography of the area, there's like a slope where the bog is, water pooled here, and then a bog formed. And so eventually, over time, maybe in like 1 or 200 years, like I said with the prairie, this might all convert back to hardwood forest. But we're still in early successional stages of the bog because of the water runoff that has gathered in this area. So, secondary succession occurs on previously occupied sites after a disturbance. This is one example, the bog. This is an example of secondary succession in an aquatic environment, in a coastal environment. This is kelp forest succession in a bay off the coast of Alaska. So it was disturbed and cleared, and then in year 1, these are the early successional species that you see, these 2 different types of macroalgae. And then those, as they decay and their populations decline, they then get overtaken by Neurocystis and the laminaria, which is the big leafy kelp. And then eventually they reach like their aquatic communities in terms of like photosynthetic organisms can reach their climax pretty early. We're just talking about plants, photosynthetic organisms, not animals. Then they reach like their quote unquote climax with the laminaria and become kelp forests again. So let's cover briefly the history of the study of succession and some of the hypotheses that have been formulated by ecologists over time. So Frederick Clements, who we talked about earlier, came up with the monoclimax hypothesis. And the monoclimax hypothesis is that the community is viewed as a highly integrated superorganism, and the process of succession represents the gradual and progressive development of the community to an ultimate or climax stage. So I've been using this word climax as like the end point of succession, and this comes from Frederick Clements' idea of the monoclimax hypothesis. You also have Egler, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, who came up with the initial floristic composition hypothesis. With this hypothesis, the process of succession at any site is dependent on whichever species just happened to get there first. So with this idea, succession is individualistic and dependent on the particular species that colonize the site and the order in which they arrive. So with this hypothesis, it just depends on what seeds end up there first and taking over first, and it really is just individually based on what species end up there. In comparison, the monoclimax hypothesis views it as a community that's very integrated. And then you have Joseph Connell and Ralph Slatyer, sorry, I'm mispronouncing that, that have these 3 different models of succession. So the facilitation model is early successional species modify the environment so that it becomes more suitable for later successional species to invade and grow to maturity. So that's kind of what I was saying earlier, is that like when algae communities grow and they decay, they then release nutrients into the environment that weren't there before and then start to create soil layers. And so that falls in line with this facilitation model. With the inhibition model, this is based mostly on strong competitive interaction, so no one species is completely superior to another, and the first species to arrive holds the site against all invaders. So this has more to do with the competitive ability of the species that are there rather than focusing on the decay and nutrient cycling of the organisms that are in the environment. Now with the tolerance model, this is later successional species are neither inhibited nor aided by species of the previous stages. So species at different stages are completely independent with each other. That kind of falls in line with the initial floristic composition hypothesis. And this leads to communities composed of the species that are most efficient at exploiting the resources available. So you see like a little bit of coevolution and superorganism here, and then you see more individualistic things going on in the inhibition and tolerance model. Now, there are a lot of hypotheses that have been put forward for studying successional patterns, but the current focus in modern ecology is on how the adaptations and life history traits of individual species influence species interactions and ultimately species distribution and abundance under changing environmental conditions. So that's the modern focus now. Now let's talk about autogenic versus allogenic changes. Autogenic changes are a direct result of the presence and activities of organisms within the community. So this would be something like the vertical profile of light in a forest that's created by a canopy. If we're thinking about, so this is some images from a study looking at colonization along Glacier Bay in Alaska. So this is like coastal colonization. I can't remember the point I was going to make about this. Anyway, with autogenic changes, we think about like sand dunes and seagrass. The early colonizers are going to, like, so in really sandy communities, early colonizers are not going to have like deep roots or anything, but they are going to, by growing in that sandy soil, they're going to decay and add more structure to it and add more organic matter, which makes it more dense and structural. And then later colonizers can then inhabit it, because before the soil was too sandy and loose for other species to inhabit it. The other thing that early colonizers usually do in like low nutrient environments that are being colonized is that they have their rhizobium associated, and then they fix nitrogen for other species that then colonize later. So autogenic is the direct result and presence of activities of organisms within the community. Allogenic, on the other hand, are features of the physical environment. So these are governed by physical rather than biological processes. So this might be something like a decline in average temperature with elevation or depth. So succession is going to probably occur in a different pattern and on a different timeline at higher elevations than it would at low elevations. So it's autogenic versus allogenic. And species diversity is going to change through succession as well. You actually don't see, most of the time when in studies that have been done so far of succession, you don't normally see the most species diversity at the climax stage, because it's going to be mostly hardwood trees, and you're going to have limited diversity on the forest floor. So you actually don't have the highest species diversity in the oldest communities. Where you see it mostly is in these earlier communities, and let's talk about why. So let's go through some of these points about species diversity. So for secondary succession, plant species diversity typically increases with the site age, but it does tend to level off. Robert Whitaker did some studies of forests in New York and found that it increases here, decreases into the shrub ages, and then decreases again as the forest ages, for those reasons that I told you why, is that once you get canopy obstruction, you can't have stuff growing on the bottom. You start to get declines. They happen when the autogenic environmental conditions, which are caused by the species that grow there, result in displacement of other species. So tree canopy shading out the understory is a great example of displacement and competition. And that rate of displacement is going to be influenced by the growth rates of the species involved in succession. So if you have slower growing hardwood trees colonizing the area, they're going to displace species slower than like a faster growing hardwood tree. Ecologist Michael Houston also looked at patterns of diversity through succession and found that they vary with environmental conditions that influence plant growth. So at least with secondary succession, it's going to depend on the nutrient availability of what is there at the beginning of succession, and how fast that successional patterns will occur. If nutrient availability tends to be high if nutrient availability is high in a new environment, succession will likely occur faster than it would in like something that's just like bare rock, right? And then there's this intermediate disturbance hypothesis, which this graph here kind of fits in line with that, is that you see patterns of high diversity at intermediate frequencies of disturbance. So prairies tend to have high patterns of diversity. And we've talked about this a little bit with prairies. What happens in prairies? Usually, we interfere with this pattern a lot. Ian's going to know the answer to this one. There's something that happens periodically in prairies that keeps them in this herbaceous stage and keeps them from entering these late stages of succession, and that is fire. Fire is one of the main ways. Fire can be bad. We like to stop it because it destroys our home and it clogs up our lungs and destroys our crops. But fire historically is good and is part of the reason California is on fire now is because we have not been doing enough periodic burning. So the indigenous peoples that originally were displaced from areas in California regularly practiced periodic burning of the environment because they knew that it stopped fires from occurring outside their control and then also increased the diversity. There are a lot of species in California in particular that are fire adapted, and so they grow better in areas that have been periodically burned. And fire is good. It can maintain diversity because it constantly is resetting the successional cycle in a forest and keeping diversity high. So this is just a picture of, I think I was telling the Monday group about this. This is my magical burned forest site that I took all my friends to because I've never seen so many flower species in one place at once. This was one of my field sites just outside of Yosemite. It is in Sierra National Forest. And I think it caught on fire 3 years before I started doing field work. That's why all the trees are still black there. Is because it had a recent fire occurrence. And that fire released nutrients into the soil. It allowed for fire-adapted species to colonize. And there was just I've never seen so many wildflowers in one place. So much diversity in one place at one time. And that was because of the fire that happened here. So succession usually is studied in terms of plants because the plants are going to dictate the animals that can occur there. The plants are also the stationary part of the environment, and so we're typically thinking about plants and photosynthetic organisms when we think about succession. But animal life is going to be a part of that too. Animal life tends to be, is often influenced more by the structural characteristic of the forest rather than the actual species, especially for bird species that are canopy dwellers. Adding a three-dimensional component to a community through higher growing plants is going to increase the animal diversity that can live there because it's going to add to the three-dimensional space of the area. And so succession, usually we're talking about plants because the animal life may not actually correspond to the stages identified by ecologists. So this is a study of bird populations looking at succession in the Piedmont of Georgia. And this is looking at diversity and species richness of bird populations. And you can see that is a stark contrast to species diversity of the plants. This is species diversity of plants that you might see in a typical forest succession. You see an increase in diversity here. But with animal species, you actually start to see it. You see an increase and an increase and maybe even more. It might even increase even more after that because you're adding vertical height to a forest or to a community as trees begin to colonize it. So you see contrasting patterns of diversity compared to plants versus animals. You can also have other changes in the physical community that are going to change how succession occurs too. So we've been talking about autogenic changes, and now we're going to talk about allogenic changes. So this is changes in the physical structure of the community. So shifts in allogenic changes that occur at periods as long or longer than organisms' lifespan are going to result in successional shifts in species dominance. In the short term, dominance is going to be correlated with species optimal temperature, nutrient, and light requirements, which may or may not be shaped by the allogenic changes in the environment. And then long-term sediment deposition is going to be a really main factor in shaping communities. So this is a really good model for what's kind of going on in Spruce Fats Bog. It was never really an open lake area as far as I know. So it's kind of always been around here. But eventually over time, as sediments accumulate in this depression where the bog has formed, you're going to see less water. That lack of water availability is going to change the species composition, and eventually it might start to look like this. And then eventually those forests, as the sediment composition changes through decay and nutrient cycling, you might see hardwoods start to colonize this area as well. And that's due to sediment composition. I can't remember why. Wait. I can't remember why I put this in here. Anyway. Okay, so communities also change over geologic time. Paleoecology is the study of the distribution and abundance of ancient organisms and their relationship to the environment. I can never pronounce it. Palynology is the study of fossil pollen. And a lot of so this is a model of what the model looking at the recession of the last glacial maxima, and a lot of this model and where you see the ice starting and then retreating is based on fossilized pollen that has been found in sediment cores and dating, radiocarbon dating of that fossil pollen. And so this is tracking like forests. It's actually a pattern of forest succession over time, based on these glaciers. And a lot of that comes from fossilized pollen, which is super cool to me. This is just a graph of the last glacial maxima where we live, and then this is what it looked like at 8,000 years ago as it started to recede. So these models of where the snow was from 8,000 years ago are mostly based on fossilized pollen that's found in sediment cores. Also, you can look at historical communities by looking at things that are fossilized in amber as well as pollen and plants. Y'all should know who that is. I shouldn't have to tell you who that is, or the importance of that staff with the bug in it. So let's go back to the concept of community that I talked about in the last one with the Frederick Clements organismic concept of community, where all of the species are very interconnected, and you see kind of like this clustering of individuals based on their relationships with each other, versus the individualistic concept where species are mostly dictated by the abiotic environment and not by their interactions with other species. How this actually plays out in the real world is it's kind of a combination of both. And if you look at communities in a three-dimensional type way, you can see this playing out. You can see both of these concepts playing out. So in this graph here, you can see, like, if you look at the distribution of species by altitude or by latitude, longitude across the surface. So you're looking at one dimension, the third dimension, altitude, and then two other dimensions here. You can see that if you look at it from just like a geographic point, just on the surface of the ground, you can see sort of distinct communities forming if you just look at like latitude, longitude. So this kind of supports the organismic concept. But if you look at it by altitude, you actually kind of see the individualistic concept playing out. So if you just are like comparing these communities by altitude, you can see they all kind of inhabit distinct altitude patterns with a little bit of overlap. So in reality, both of these are true for a lot of communities. There's going to be abiotic environments that heavily dictate their distribution as well as their interactions with the other organisms in the environment. and I can't remember why I put this in here, but this is a really great graph for illustrating how you can have the organismic concept of community being displayed in an environment as well as the individualistic continuum concept. So that's it. That's it for exam 3. If you have any questions while you're studying, please don't hesitate to ask me. Slack and Schoology are the best ways to get in contact with me. Email also works, but I get a lot of emails every day, so I prefer that you use Schoology or Slack. And I will be on call on Thursday if you have any last minute questions. If you have not worked through the practice problems for the exam that I uploaded in the in-person activities, please do that. Those are basically like just very slightly different versions of what I will ask in the essay questions on the exam. So they're really important practice. I am happy to check your answers and go through them with you. I would love to do that actually. So please do that. And I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.